Now, the first one we're going to talk about is going to be carbohydrates. So if you look at a food label, you will see carbohydrates because we use carbohydrates partially for energy. That's one of the major things that they serve. And you'll see starch is how plants tend to store it for energy. That's why we like starchy foods like potatoes. And then glycogen will just be the way that animals tend to store it for energy. This is how we store sugars that we eat in our liver. We can stick them together to form these big, long chains where each of these little guys is a simple sugar. Each of these is what we'll know as a glucose, a monosaccharide. And when we stick a whole bunch together, that's when we get essentially this glycogen. That's how we store it. Now with carbohydrates, we're normally going to kind of refer to these guys by two names. You'll see sugars is a common name we'll say, and then you'll notice saccharide is the other term that we'll use to be, okay, we're talking about carbohydrates here. So if you see sugars or saccharides, red flag, carbohydrate. The other thing that you can notice about them is if I give you a chemical formula, carbohydrates almost always have this formula where they have about 1 carbon for every 2 hydrogens for every 1 oxygen. So for instance, glucose, probably the most common sugar that we will talk about. That's going to be C6H12O6, 1 to 2 to 1. And because most of the stuff we're going to talk about, cellulose here, glycogen, starch, are going to be polymers of glucose, a bunch of glucoses stuck together, we're still going to see this general formula of about 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. So if I give you a chemical formula that looks like that, you should right away go carbohydrate. Now, monosaccharides will be what we call simple sugars. So this is one of these guys. That's going to be a monosaccharide. We can also take 2 of those guys and stick them together and we'll get a disaccharide. We bring this up because a lot of the food that we eat contains disaccharides. So for instance, sucrose, table sugar, is going to be a disaccharide. That one's going to be a fructose, a particular type of sugar that's a monosaccharide, stuck to a glucose, a different type of monosaccharide. And that's the one that we tend to eat in our foods that tastes good. You also have lactose, which is going to be a galactose and a glucose. So it's still glucose, it's just with a different monosaccharide partner. So that's the stuff we tend to find in milk and ice cream that gives people some digestive issues. And then if we keep going, if we don't just stop at 2 monosaccharides and we just keep going in many cases to hundreds or thousands of glucoses, we get to polysaccharides. And we've talked about starch and glycogen are the ones that we use for food, but there is actually some other stuff that we can get. There's some other uses for carbohydrates, and that tends to be structure. So for a lot of organisms, they will actually use special types of carbohydrates that allow them to build critical structure for their cells, for their entire form. And the 2 that we'll discuss are cellulose, which is going to be in plant cell walls. And so this is what we know as fiber because we can't break it down. It's very tough, it's very tightly bonded, and so we do not possess the correct enzymes to break it down. So if we eat it, it just goes through our system. And so it helps clean out your system, which is, I suppose, good. That's why people take fiber. But it's not something where if you eat fiber, you're going to get actual caloric benefit. You're not going to get energy from it because we can't break it down properly to get that energy out. There's energy there, but we just can't access it because we don't have the right enzymes. And then chitin is what you'll see most commonly referred to in like insect exoskeleton. So this is like the part that makes the insect crunchy. It's that outer shell that they have is going to be what's made of chitin. And so this is kind of a cool one where it's very strong, very rigid, and so it's fairly light. And so insects will use this as their equivalent of a skeleton or armor or protection. So at the bottom here, just to make sure we're clear, if I ask you, we use this for energy. Obviously, you can eat sugary stuff and you can get energy from it. And we also are going to use this, depending on the type of organism, we will use this in some cases for structural purposes. Lipids. All right, lipids are going to be kind of the oddball when it comes to macromolecules because lipids don't really have a true monomer. When we talked about carbohydrates, monosaccharides were their monomer. It's very clear cut, monosaccharide, polysaccharide. With lipids, some people will say that these fatty acid tails are essentially their monomer, but there are several different types of lipids and they don't all have fatty acid tails. So many lipids will not actually have a monomer. Some of them will just be built straight up from scratch. They will not actually be this polymer idea. Now, their claim to fame is that they're going to be hydrophobic. They don't like water. And this is because they're composed almost entirely of carbon and hydrogen, which together are nonpolar. And nonpolar things don't like water because water's polar. And so this will be one of the kind of critical things that we use to identify lipids, the fact that they're nonpolar, or at least mostly nonpolar. They might have little regions that are polar, and the fact that they dislike water, right? So they do have two parts in general. So when we talk about fats and oils, which are two of the most common types of lipids, there are two others called steroids, which make up many hormones. That's why you can take steroids to try to bulk up, or you can take steroids to try to shut things down in our body, like asthma medication. So steroids do exist. You do have waxes is another type that's ultimately a lipid that's not going to be a fat or an oil. But most of the lipids we talk about will be fats and oils. So they're going to be composed of this kind of head region, all right? And that head region does tend to be polar, but it also tends to be relatively small. They then have these long tail regions that are all carbon and hydrogen. So these tail regions are entirely non-polar. And so because they comprise the bulk of the molecule, we generally consider as a whole fats and oils to be nonpolar because that's how they tend to react. They do not like water. These long carbon and hydrogen tails do not like it. Now, depending on the particular type of lipid we're talking about, some will have two tails. The guys with two tails you'll see we'll call phospholipids. These guys are critical because they're what our membranes in our body, like our cell membranes, are made of. So our cells have to have a bunch of phospholipids for us to live. We'll also see some of them that have three tails, sometimes called triglycerides, and the guys with three tails are the ones primarily used for things like fat storage that we'll use for energy. So we've got a whole bunch of these different types of guys that will vary. So don't freak out when we talk about stuff. There's lots of different types of these. And so they obviously do energy storage. They're the most efficient. They can store more energy in the same amount of mass versus any of the others. So this is why long term, if we've got extra energy, we try to store it as fats because it's the most efficient way to store it. It also gives us insulation, so you can see that a layer of fat around our body helps protect us from being out in the cold. It helps protect our body from changing temperature too quickly. And they can help with some of our stuff. You'll see some communication is done with lipids. So this isn't, like I said, steroids basically are used as chemical messengers. So some of our communication will fall under the same category. Now, as we talk about these types of lipids, I want to kind of make sure the difference between some of them. So we brought up triglycerides, and their claim to fame really is that they tend to be fats if they're solid at room temperature and oils if they're liquid. So most of the stuff that we call fats and oils that we eat is going to be triglycerides, and the only difference between those two, at least most obvious one, is if you have to pour it and it's like at room temperature, that's an oil. When you have to go through and you cut it off like meat where it's still solid, like that whitish, yellowish stuff that you can cut off meat, that's going to be called a fat. But they're very similar structurally. You know, they're still going to be this three-tail idea with a head region at the front. Now, the reason that you have the difference between these two is whether or not they have double bonds in their tails, the fatty acids. And if you have double bonds in the fatty acids, that tends to favor oils because these double bonds that you have tend to make, you'll notice this one kind of kinks. And so that's what you tend to see if this is what we call an unsaturated fat. So if you look at a food label and see unsaturated, that's what you're looking at. And so that will tend to be oils. Whereas if it's nice and straight like this, where it's relatively together, that's normally considered saturated fat. Okay, and that would be a fat. And that's because it does not have a double bond. So we call it saturated because it has as many hydrogens as possible. Whereas if I've got an unsaturated, because I added a double bond, it means we have to get rid of some of our hydrogens to make room for that double bond. Because carbon can only form 4 bonds, right? So if I've got 2 carbons bonded, I still have room for 3 other bonds, 3 other hydrogens, if you will. But if I do a double bond, I can't have these 2 hydrogens that would normally be there. So I have to get rid of 2 hydrogens to form a double bond. So we don't have the max possible hydrogens, hence we're not saturated with hydrogen. If we don't have any double bonds, we have the most amount of hydrogen possible, so it's saturated with hydrogen. That's where the name comes from. So in general, though, don't be afraid of fats too much. We're finding out more and more it's actually sugars that are screwing with us, so don't hate on fats. And then we've discussed the fact that phospholipids have 2 tails and are found in cell membranes. So this essentially right here is going to be a phospholipid. And then we've discussed the fact that we do have these steroid messengers, and we do have waxes, which are used primarily for waterproofing. Neither of those have monomers. These guys each have their own kind of unique purposes. This right here is a steroid. So if you notice, steroids' claim to fame is it has these 4 carbon rings. So if you see the 4 carbon rings, that ultimately is going to be a steroid. I don't think I'll give you pictures. I'm not going to focus too much on steroids. Right now, my main emphasis would be on you should know basically what fats and oils look like.